I have been staring at the exact same page of a book for 3 days. It is a book I thought I knew better than almost anything else in my life. A book I spent most of my adult years treating as the absolute baseline of reality. But there is this one sentence. Actually, it is not even a full sentence. It is just 3 words, repeated 3 separate times, and I cannot stop thinking about it. It started a few nights ago. I was sitting on my porch, just going through a biblical concordance. It is a habit I picked up recently, cross-referencing names, tracking how certain words appear in the original Greek. I was looking up the disciple Thomas. You know him. Everybody knows him. Doubting Thomas. The guy who needed to put his fingers in the wounds to believe the resurrection. That is the whole story we were told. That is the entire box they put him in. But as I was looking at the Gospel of John, I noticed something I had never seen before. Not in all my years sitting in church pews. Not in decades of Sunday school. John does not just call him Thomas. In 3 separate places. John chapter 11, verse 16. Chapter 20, verse 24. And chapter 21, verse 2. 3 times, John uses a very specific, very strange formula. He writes, Thomas called Didymus. Thomas called Didymus. At first glance, it sounds like a formal title, like Simon called Peter. But here is the thing that kept me awake. Here is the thing that made me put the book down and just stare out into the dark yard. Thomas is not a name. Not originally. In Aramaic, the language they actually spoke, the word is toma, and toma literally translates to twin. And Didymus? Didymus is not a last name. It is the Greek word for twin. So what John is actually writing, what the text literally says, is twin, called twin. He is translating the word for his Greek readers. But why? Why translate it, and why repeat that translation 3 times? Let me back up. When you start digging into ancient documents, there is a rule you learn very quickly. When a source takes the trouble to translate a word twice, into 2 different languages, for the same reader, multiple times, it is not doing it by accident. It is pointing at something it cannot say directly. It is a blinking red light on the dashboard of history. The moment I saw that double naming, the pattern screamed at me. It is textual signaling. But as someone who spent half their life sitting in church pews, trusting the people at the pulpit, I felt this cold knot in my stomach. Because nobody ever pointed this out. Nobody in my church ever assigned that same critical reading to this particular verse. I sat there on the porch and I thought, twin called twin. Twin of whom? Why call someone a twin? Translate it so the reader absolutely cannot miss the meaning, but never ever mention who the other half is. If you have a twin brother standing right next to you, people call you the twins. But if you are just called the twin, it implies your sibling is someone significant, someone everybody already knows. I thought it would be a quick answer, a quick search. I figured there was some historical footnote I had missed. I figured theologians had a perfectly reasonable explanation for this. I was wrong. I was so profoundly wrong. I entered this question expecting a fast resolution. I ended up in a labyrinth that took me 3 months to navigate. And I am still not sure I have found my way out. The deeper I dug, the more the silence around this question felt intentional. The apologetic answers were almost insultingly simple. They would say, "Oh, it is just a nickname." Like calling a tall guy Stretch. He was a twin, maybe his brother died in childbirth, it does not matter. The Gospel of John was just clarifying the word's meaning for Greek readers. Except that does not hold up. If it were merely a translation clarification, like the phrase Messiah, which means Christ, it would appear once. John uses this exact double naming 3 separate times, far beyond any editorial need for a Greek-speaking audience. And then I found Richard Bauckham. He is a serious scholar, University of St. Andrews. He wrote a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Bauckham points out that Thomas functioned as a descriptive nickname rather than a formal given name. But he also notes something else, something that shifted the ground under my feet. He points out that Eastern Syrian Christian traditions preserved his full name. They did not just call him Thomas. They called him Judas Thomas, Judas the twin. They did this to distinguish him from the other disciple named Judas. But canonical gospel editors in the West removed that first name. They just left the nickname. The twin. I remember sitting in my living room, the sun coming up, papers spread out all over the coffee table. I had this sudden, terrible thought. What if everything I was taught about the identity of Jesus was carefully edited? What if there was a historical reality that the early church found so uncomfortable, so unmanageable, that they had to literally erase a man's name and leave only his nickname? I almost gave up here. I really did. I was tired. It was late, or early, depending on how you look at it. I thought, maybe I am making too much of this. Maybe it really is just a linguistic quirk. Maybe I am looking for ghosts in a 2,000-year-old text because I am angry about how much I trusted the institution that handed it to me. I was ready to close the books. I was ready to walk away. But then I saw a reference to something discovered in 1945. In a town in Egypt called Nag Hammadi, peasants dug up a jar containing ancient manuscripts. These were texts that the early Orthodoxy had tried to burn. Texts they had labeled as heresy. One of these documents is called the Book of Thomas the Contender. It is dated to around the year 150 to 225. That is the exact same era when the final editions of the canonical Gospel of John were circulating. I found a translation by John D. Turner. I started reading. And in section 138, line 4, I stopped breathing for a second. Jesus is speaking directly to the apostle. And Jesus says this, quote, "Now since it has been said that you are my twin and true companion, examine yourself and learn who you are." My twin. Jesus literally addresses him as my twin and true companion. This is not a 19th century conspiracy theory. This is a primary manuscript from the early 2nd century, circulating in the same Egyptian Christian communities that produced the canonical Gospels. And it gets heavier. I found another text. The Acts of Thomas. This is a Syriac manuscript from around the year 220. It documents the early Syrian Christian belief that Judas Thomas was the physical twin of Jesus. The text actually records scenes where people, including a king named Gudnefar, mistake Thomas for Jesus because they look completely identical. The Edessan Church, which is the oldest self-identified Christian community in the world, preserved this tradition. For them, Thomas being the twin was not a metaphor. It was not a fringe heresy. It was an unquestioned foundational narrative. Let that sink in. There were early Christians, living closer to the events than the men who finalized our Bible, who explicitly believed Jesus had an identical twin brother. And they believed this brother was one of his closest disciples. I thought back to my church days. I thought about the story of doubting Thomas. We were taught that Thomas was the skeptic, the one who failed the faith test, the one who had to touch the wounds to believe the resurrection. It was a lesson about blind faith. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. But now, looking at these older traditions, a chilling alternative explanation started to form in my mind. What if the story of doubting Thomas was invented or heavily edited by gospel writers specifically to cover up or counter alternative traditions about Jesus having an identical twin? If people knew there was a man walking around who looked exactly like Jesus, the resurrection accounts suddenly have a massive historical complication. The Orthodoxy needed to neutralize Thomas. They needed to turn him from the privileged twin brother into the peripheral doubter. They needed to make him the guy who proves the physical wounds are real, precisely because he looks like the guy with the wounds. I did not want to believe this. I really did not. Because of what it costs. I wanted to say, well, these apocryphal texts were rejected because they were late forgeries. That is what the apologists say. But it is not true. The Book of Thomas the Contender dates to the exact same time as the final edits of John. The Acts of Thomas were written within living memory of communities preserving oral tradition from the earliest generations. Heresy is just a category invented by guys like Irenaeus of Lyon around the year 180, specifically to label competing Christian communities. Calling these texts forgeries is just naming the verdict of the winners. It is not a neutral historical assessment. I would like to unknow this. I really would. Not because it destroys my faith. My faith broke a long time ago. But because of the epistemic innocence I lost. I always thought that even if the Bible had contradictions, even if the theology was messy, we were at least looking at the whole board. I thought the history we had was the history that existed. Now, I do not know how to look at it anymore. I cannot unsee the intentional suppression. Every time I see the word Thomas now, I do not see a doubter. I see a redacted name. I see a twin whose identity was so dangerous to the official narrative that they turned him into a cautionary tale about asking for evidence. You do not unlearn this. You just learn to carry it. You learn to read the silences in the text. I remember reading an account recently from an ex-evangelical guy. He was taking a college New Testament Greek course. The instructor was parsing John 11:16. The instructor noted that Thomas called Didymus literally renders as twin called twin. And this guy wrote about how he felt completely lied to. He said, I had been taught doubting Thomas as a lesson about faith. Nobody taught me Thomas was a proper noun that meant twin. Nobody taught me there were ancient texts where Jesus called him my twin and true companion. That is not a minor footnote. That is the whole conversation. I feel exactly the same way. We were handed a heavily curated document and told it was the direct, unmediated word of God. We were not told about the Syrian church in Edessa. We were not told about the Gospel of Thomas. We were not told that the earliest Christians had fierce, fundamental disagreements about who Jesus even was. And now I am left with this. I entered this question as a researcher. I leave it as someone to whom this matters deeply. Because it is not just about ancient history. It is about how narratives are controlled. It is about how the people in power get to decide what is truth and what is heresy. I spent 35 years of my life as a high school history teacher. 35 years of teaching teenagers how to read primary sources, how to look for the things a text is trying to hide. And the one thing I always told them was that when a text translates a word twice, it is pointing at something it cannot say directly. I was right. The Gospel of John was pointing at something, but it was not pointing to reveal it. It was pointing to contain it. I was right. The Gospel of John was pointing at something, but it was not pointing to reveal it. It was pointing to contain it. They could not completely erase the fact that he was called the twin because it was too widely known. So they kept the nickname, stripped his actual name, and built a story around him that validated their specific theological needs. It is brilliant, and it is devastating. I do not know what you do with this information. I do not know if it changes anything for you. But for me, it changes how I read every single word they handed down to us. Let me walk you through exactly what happens when you start pulling on this thread. Because at first you think it is just a translation anomaly. You think, okay, Aramaic was the spoken language, Greek was the written language of the New Testament, so John is just being helpful. He is just saying, hey, this guy we call Thomas, his name means twin in Greek, Didymus. But why repeat it? Why chapter 11, chapter 20, and chapter 21? I sat with that question for a solid week. I read every commentary I could find from my old church days. The standard apologetic response is always the same. They wave their hands and say, oh, it was just a common nickname, probably because he was a twin, but his sibling is entirely irrelevant to the biblical narrative. Irrelevant. That is the word they use. But when you read the Gospel of John closely, you realize John does not do irrelevant. John is the most highly theological, meticulously structured of all the Gospels. Every single word in John is placed there to serve a specific theological agenda. He is the gospel writer who turns water into wine not just as a party trick, but as a profound symbol of the old covenant being replaced by the new. He does not waste ink on useless trivia. So when John stops his narrative to say Thomas called Didymus, he is not giving you trivia. He is managing a problem. And to understand that problem, you have to look at the map of early Christianity. We were taught that Christianity started in Jerusalem, moved to Rome, and spread neatly across the Western world. We were taught a straight line. But history is never a straight line. History is a web. While the Roman Church was building its theology and deciding which books would eventually become the New Testament canon, there was an entirely different branch of Christianity developing in the East. In Syria. Specifically, in a city called Edessa. The Edessan church is incredibly important. They are the oldest self-identified Christian community in the world, and they did not speak Greek. They spoke Syriac, which is a dialect of Aramaic, the exact same language family that Jesus and the disciples spoke. They were closer to the linguistic and cultural roots of the movement than the Greek-speaking editors in the West. And the Edessan church traced its entire spiritual lineage directly to one man, Judas Thomas. They did not just have stories about him. They had a massive, thriving theological tradition built around his teachings. And in their tradition, Thomas was not the guy who doubted. He was the guy who understood. He was the one disciple who grasped the deepest, most profound spiritual truths that Jesus was teaching. And why did he understand? Because, according to the Syrian Christians, he was the literal physical twin brother of Jesus. I want to pause here for a second. Because when I first read this, my brain immediately tried to reject it. My Southern Baptist conditioning kicked in hard. I thought, this has to be a metaphor. They must mean a spiritual twin, like a kindred spirit. That is how we explain away anything uncomfortable in the Bible. We turn it into a metaphor. But the ancient texts do not let you do that. They are stubbornly literal. I mentioned the Acts of Thomas earlier. Let me tell you exactly what happens in that text. It was written around the year 220. It tells the story of Thomas traveling to India. And there is a scene where Thomas is attending a royal wedding feast for King Gudnifar. During the feast, the king sees Thomas and completely mistakes him for Jesus. The text explicitly describes them as looking identical. It describes them as having the exact same physical appearance. This is not a spiritual metaphor. The people who wrote and preserved this text believed, as a matter of historical fact, that there was a man walking the earth who shared the exact face of Jesus of Nazareth. And then you have the book of Thomas the Contender, found at Nag Hammadi. I need to emphasize how shattering this discovery was. Before 1945, we only knew about these alternative Christianities from the writings of the people who hunted them down. We only knew what the heresy hunters like Irenaeus said about them. It is like trying to understand a defense attorney by only reading the prosecutor's closing argument. But at Nag Hammadi, we got the defense attorney's actual files. We got the original documents, preserved in the dry Egyptian sand for over 1,600 years. And right there in the book of Thomas the Contender, you have a dialogue between Jesus and Thomas. And Jesus says, quote, "Now since it has been said that you are my twin and true companion, examine yourself and learn who you are." This was not a minority fringe opinion. This was a massive, foundational belief for an entire branch of ancient Christianity, a branch that existed concurrently with the communities that were writing and editing the canonical Gospels. So let us go back to the Gospel of John. Let us look at it not as a magical book dropped from heaven, but as a historical document written by men who were trying to establish their version of the truth as the only version. Imagine you are the author of the Gospel of John. You are writing in the late 1st or early 2nd century. You are dealing with competing Christian communities. And you know that over in Syria, there is this massive group of believers who revere Thomas as the twin brother of Jesus, and who claim that Thomas has the secret, deeper teachings. And even worse for your theology, if people believe Jesus had an identical twin, the stories of the resurrection become incredibly difficult to defend. Because if someone saw a man walking around after the crucifixion who looked exactly like Jesus, the easiest explanation for a skeptic is that they simply saw the twin. You have a Thomas problem. A massive Thomas problem. So what do? You cannot just pretend he did not exist. He is too famous. He is too deeply embedded in the oral traditions. So you do what any brilliant editor does. You control the narrative. You write a story. You write a story that only appears in your gospel. Matthew does not have it. Mark does not have it. Luke does not have it. Only John. You write the story of doubting Thomas. You take the man who the Eastern Church says is the closest, most spiritually advanced twin brother, and you turn him into the guy who fails the test. You make him the skeptic. You make him the one who refuses to believe unless he can literally put his fingers into the physical wounds of the resurrected Jesus. And do you see the genius of it? Do you see how perfectly it solves the problem? By making Thomas the one who verifies the physical wounds, John completely neutralizes the twin hypothesis. John is saying, look, it was not the twin that people saw after the resurrection, because the twin himself inspected the wounds. The twin himself admitted it was Jesus. And just to make sure nobody gets confused, just to make sure you distance him from his actual identity, you strip away his real name. You never call him Judas. You just translate his nickname twice. Thomas called Didymus. Twin called twin. You reduce his identity to a redundant label, and you define his entire legacy by a moment of failure. It is a masterful piece of theological PR. I realized this sitting in my living room, surrounded by books, and I felt sick. I actually felt physically nauseous, because I spent decades teaching Sunday school classes about doubting Thomas. I stood up in front of young people and told them not to be like Thomas. I told them that faith means believing without seeing. I used a story that was almost certainly invented as a political hit piece to enforce compliance in teenagers. I wanted to unknow it. I wanted to close the books and go back to the simple, clean narrative where the good guys wrote the Bible and the bad guys were the heretics. But you cannot. You cannot unsee the strings once you notice them. This is what happens when you start actually looking at the history of how the Bible was put together. It is not just that you find contradictions. Contradictions you can live with. Contradictions just mean human beings make mistakes. What you find is much harder to live with. You find intentionality. You find suppression. You find the conscious erasure of competing voices. I always believed that even if the theology was complicated, the history was clean. I believed that the people who compiled the canon were just faithfully passing down what happened. But they were not. They were fighting a war for the survival of their specific interpretation of Jesus. And in a war, the first casualty is always the full truth. When you learn that heresy was a category invented by the winners to delegitimize the losers, everything changes. The apocryphal texts are not late forgeries. They are the suppressed voices of the communities that lost the political battle for orthodoxy. And that brings me back to the ex-evangelical student I mentioned earlier, the guy in the Greek class. He wrote about how betrayed he felt when the instructor explained the literal translation of Thomas called Didymus. He said, "Nobody taught me there were ancient texts where Jesus called him my twin." That is not a minor footnote. That is the whole conversation. He was right. It is the whole conversation. Because if they curated this out of the narrative, if they actively managed the identity of a major disciple to protect a theological position, what else did they manage? What else was edited, smoothed over, or outright invented to ensure that the Western Orthodox narrative won? I am not sitting here telling you that I know exactly who the historical Jesus was. I am not telling you that the Syrian church was right, and the Roman Church was wrong. What I am telling you is that the certainty we were handed is a manufactured certainty. It is an edited certainty, and for me, that is the price of this kind of research. It is a heavy price. I lost the ability to read the text innocently. I lost the comfort of trusting the narrator. Every time I open the Gospel of John now, I am reading it like a hostile witness. I am looking for what he is trying to hide. I wanted to find a historical explanation for a weird linguistic repetition. I ended up finding the fingerprints of a 2,000-year-old cover-up. And the worst part is, it worked perfectly. For 20 centuries, millions of us sat in church and learned about doubting Thomas. And almost none of us ever thought to ask, twin of whom? We were handed a beautifully constructed box, and we never once bothered to look under the lid. I cannot do that anymore. I just cannot do it. If this resonates with you, if you are tired of being handed the sanitized version of history, and you want to look at the raw materials for yourself, that is exactly why I put together the Spinoza Forever Library. The link is pinned in the comments below. It is 5 volumes where we dig into these exact kinds of suppressed histories, the textual anomalies, the things they left out of the Sunday school curriculum. It is for people who need to see the primary sources for themselves, and if you have made it this far into the video, you are my kind of person. This channel is dedicated to having these uncomfortable, necessary conversations, the ones that are usually forbidden in traditional religious spaces. Hitting the subscribe button is the best way to tell the algorithm to keep putting this kind of historical deep dive in front of you. I really want to know what you think about this. Does learning the historical context of Thomas being called the twin change how you view the stories you were told about him? Does it change how you read the Gospel of John? Or do you think I am reading too much into a translation quirk? Let me know in the comments. I read as many as I can, and I always appreciate the pushback. Take care of yourselves.